Antisemitism in the West, a podcast by Dr. Arpaia. Let's begin by looking at my 4 expectations. First, I want you to understand our definition of antisemitism and how to apply it in our course. Second, I want you to understand the potential for conflict among societies in the Abrahamic tradition. Third, I want you to understand the historical terms the West and Western civilization. We will start our consideration of antisemitism in the ancient world, but a consideration of the West and Western civilization will help us understand the endpoint of our inquiry in the modern world of today and the relevance of antisemitism to our own lives. Let me add that we defined civilization as the material production and the cultural creations of any given group of humans in a given area of the world. And finally, I want you to understand the connection between antisemitism and the West. Let's review our working definition of antisemitism and how we will use it. We devised a scientific definition for antisemitism. By scientific, we mean that we have a verifiable definition. Anyone using the same criteria that we have adopted will conclude that a case in point fits the definition or not. In the first podcast, I explained that our working definition has 4 core elements. All 4 must be present in a case study for us to conclude that we have found an example of antisemitism. If 1, 2, or 3 elements are present, the example falls short of antisemitism. If no core elements are present, the example is completely different. Remember, too, that we are not looking for isolated cases of the core elements, but rather for evidence of systemic antisemitism. Systemic means that antisemitism is not limited, sporadic, or insignificant. It is pervasive, persistent, and inescapable. Systemic antisemitism is infused in social, political, economic, and cultural institutions and in a society's very way of life. Systemic antisemitism is pervasive, persistent, and inescapable because it governs how people live their lives and because an anti-Semitic society teaches members that antisemitism is acceptable and normal and will always be that way. So if one lives in a society in which antisemitism is systemic, it does not matter if a person is anti-Semitic or not. Antisemitism still exists because the game, so to speak, is fixed so that Jews can never belong. And unless one can uncover the history of antisemitism, one will have a difficult, even impossible time figuring out that the deck is stacked against Jews. The first core element of antisemitism is an anti-Semitic Weltanschauung, by which we mean a worldview in which the Jews, all Jews, and Jewishness play a fundamental role in the perception of humanity. Our model allows the core terms Jew and Jewishness to be changeful. The first core element gives antisemitism its systemic quality and differentiates it from the common meaning of antisemitism, a dislike for Jews. If people think that the Jews are harmful to humanity, the Jews and Jewishness will become an obsession, and the presence of Jews in society will become a question that must be resolved with their elimination. Similarly, if an individual thinks that the Jews have a decisively dangerous part to play in human history, the Jews and Jewishness will become a fixation, and the individual will demand that the supposed Jewish threat be eliminated. The second core element is a reliance on negative stereotypes about Jews that juxtaposes Jews and non-Jews as intrinsically different. The third core element follows from the second. It is a specific way of thinking about Jews that negates their individuality. Anti-Semites deny the humanity of Jews. The final core element is a reliance on mythopoeia to assert the supposed evil nature of Jews and Jewishness. If you do not understand these core elements, please go back to the first podcast and review them. Now, let's turn to my second expectation. In my podcast on the Hebrews and the Jews, I stated that the Hebrew sense of identity was based on their connection to Abraham and his God. They were Abraham's heirs, and thus heirs to the identity of the chosen people. The Israelites and the Jews saw themselves as the heirs to the Hebrews. So too were the followers of Jesus and the Christians, and the followers of Muhammad and all Muslims. These rival claims as the one true God's chosen people created a potential rivalry among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Let's review this potential, and please note that I carefully chose the word potential. It means having latent qualities that may develop and lead to consequences in the future. Let's begin our consideration of a potential rivalry among the three Abrahamic traditions by considering the connections the Israelites and Jews made to Abraham. Both Israelites and Jews believed that they were the biological heirs to Abraham. Their claim to the identity of the chosen people was theirs by birthright. The truth of their claim was to be found in Hebrew myths, that is, narratives that purport to assert universal truths. These myths were narratives related orally by the Hebrews and the Israelites until the Jews edited and compiled them in written form as the Hebrew Bible, around the year 500 BCE. The Bible recounted how the inheritance of the covenant passed from Abraham to his son Isaac, and then from Isaac to his son Jacob, but not Isaac's older son Esau, and from Jacob to his 12 sons, the mythic progenitors of the 12 tribes of Israel. No historical evidence proves or disproves this biological claim, but we must remember that, with belief systems, historical evidence is not necessarily required to prove the veracity of a claim. The narrative itself, and its telling and retelling, constitute the proof. So, for both the Israelites and the Jews, they claim their identity as the chosen people based on biology. But they also had a theological basis for calling themselves the chosen people that was grounded too in Hebrew myth. According to Hebrew myth, the one true God had made a covenant with Abraham. According to the covenant, the chosen people had to believe in the one true God and follow its laws. According to the Bible, the covenant was reaffirmed with Moses, who supposedly led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, compiled about 600 laws, which became known as the Mosaic Law, and then showed the Israelites a territory belonging to the Canaanites, and told them that the God of Abraham had supposedly given it to them as their promised land. Next, let's consider the basis for the same claims by the followers of Jesus. We will consider this topic fully in a later class. We use the term Jesus-centered Jews to designate this original group, because the men and women who followed Jesus were Jews and did not call themselves Christian. The title Christian would come later, starting somewhere during the 3rd and 4th century CE, when the followers of Jesus were increasingly Gentile. The early followers of Jesus claimed the right to call themselves the chosen people because they were Jews, and as such they had the same biological claim as other Jews to be called the chosen people. Like other Jews, Jesus-centered Jews asserted a theological descent from Abraham, but their claim was nuanced. They followed Jesus' teachings about the Mosaic Law, which diverged from the ways other Jewish groups interpreted the Law of Moses. Jesus-centered Jews slowly transformed over the next 300 years. Growing theological disagreements with rival Jewish groups led, ultimately, to a split within Judaism. The followers of Jesus increasingly called themselves Christians and claimed that a biological attachment to Abraham was no longer required by the God of Abraham to be the chosen people. There was only one basis to the claim of the title, the chosen people. it was through Jesus' teachings in a broader sense than just the Mosaic Law. According to the Christian interpretation of Hebrew myth, the covenant between Abraham and his God had been superseded. With the arrival of Jesus, the God of Abraham offered all of humanity, and not just the Jews, a new covenant. That covenant was based primarily on two elements: adherence to a set of teachings the Christians attributed to Jesus, rather than trying to follow more perfectly the teachings of Moses, and acceptance of Jesus as God, the same God as the God of Abraham, a concept that did not make sense to Jews. Christians believe that they replaced the Jews as the chosen people. According to a Christian way of thinking, the Jews had been the chosen people up until the life of Jesus. Thus, Jesus' lifetime marked a turning point in human history. Jesus had called the Jews to accept him as the one true God. Since Jews refused to accept Jesus' teachings, they lost the right to call themselves the chosen people. This claim signified that the covenant between the one true God and Abraham was a covenant whose time had expired during Jesus' lifetime. It had been replaced by a new covenant between Jesus as the God of Abraham and anyone, including non-Jews, who accepted him as God and followed the teachings that the Christians now attributed to Jesus. So, for Christians, the Jews had become the old chosen people, and they, the Christians, took the place of the Jews as a new chosen people. The Christians then set about editing and reinterpreting Jewish mythopoeia in the light of their new beliefs. The Christian revision and reinterpretation of Jewish scripture remained vital for Christians. They called it the Old Testament and claimed that it proved that Jesus was the God of Abraham and that he had a unique role in the history of mankind. Christian leaders also collected oral traditions about Jesus and his early followers, eliminated some of them, and compiled and edited others, adding letters written by early Jesus-centered Jews, and made this collection of documents a sort of second volume to their revised Hebrew Bible, calling it the New Testament. Together, the Old and New Testaments constituted a Christian Bible that wrote the Hebrews out of history as the chosen people. Up until Jesus' ministry, the God of Abraham had directed human history through the Jews. But from Jesus' ministry onward, the God of Abraham was directing human history through the Christians, not the Jews. Finally, let's consider the bases for the Muslim claim to be called the chosen people. Like the Jews and early followers of Jesus, the Muslims also made a claim of biological descent from Abraham, thus making them heirs to the birthright of the covenant and the title of the chosen people. The way Muslims made their claim was to rewrite Hebrew mythopoeia. The myth of Abraham's covenant remained basically the same, and so too did the birth of his two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and the claim that Ishmael was the progenitor of the Arabs. However, the Islamic narrative differed in one vital way. The Muslims claimed that Ishmael was the true heir to the covenant, and the title of the chosen people was his because he was the firstborn son of Abraham. Isaac, as the second son, could not have inherited what belonged to the firstborn. Muslims concurred with the Jews that the Arabs were the direct descendants of Ishmael, but now they claimed it was through Ishmael that the Muslims inherited the title of the chosen people. Like Jews and Christians, Muslims also made a claim of theological descent from Abraham. Muslims accepted many aspects of Jewish and Christian mythopoeia, but they claimed that the Jews had erred with the Mosaic Law. It needed to be corrected. The Christians had also gotten things wrong. Jesus was a prophet, not a god. Instead, he was the greatest prophet up to that point in human history. The one true God sent him to correct the Jews. Muslims claimed that the same one true God made itself known to Muhammad, an Arab and a direct descendant of Ishmael. Muhammad's mission was to correct humanity, as the last and greatest of all prophets, by giving humanity the most correct version of how to submit to God through obedience to divine law. Muhammad's followers wrote down the teachings they attributed to Muhammad, which became the basis for the Quran. As we shall explore later in the course, while the followers of Muhammad laid claim to the covenant and the identity as the chosen people, early Muslims did not believe that the Christians or Jews had lost their own special relationships to the one true God. We can think of the Islamic worldview in the following terms. The Muslims saw themselves as the chosen people of the one true God. The one true God had revealed itself to Abraham, but some of his descendants had misunderstood what the God had intended. Still, the Jews had been good at following divine law, especially in recognizing the true nature of God. So the one true God sent Jesus to offer a much-needed corrective, making Christians better at following the laws of the same God than the Jews. But Christians had also gotten some things wrong, especially about the nature of Jesus. So, the one true God sent Muhammad to offer a final corrective, making the Muslims the best at following the laws of the same one God. And, as we shall see when we consider the relationship between Jews and Muslims in early Islamic society, this nuance provided for a fundamental difference in how Islamic and Christian societies treated Jews. Now, let's turn to my fourth expectation. I want you to understand the two key terms, the West and Western civilization. Scholars define the West as comprising a group of societies in Western Europe that began to industrialize starting in the 17th century. Industrialization was the key to the transformation of agricultural societies in Western Europe. Eastern Europe, for reasons I won't go into here, did not follow the same developmental model, according to these historians. Industrialization made Western European countries more powerful and wealthier than societies elsewhere that did not industrialize. Industrialization began as some people realized the importance of using technology and capital in new ways in the workplace. Capital can be defined simply as wealth in the form of money. Its advantage lies in the ability to use money in business or financial activities. Money does not tie up wealth in things that may or may not have value to other people, and it does not have to be converted into money to be spent. Technology and capital were first used to mechanize agriculture. Industrialized forms of farming enabled landowners to hire fewer farmhands, yet still increase agricultural output, thus creating more capital that could be reinvested into farming or invested into new activities, such as manufacturing or financial investments. Technology and capital were quickly used to mechanize manufacturing as well. The creation of the factory system also increased profits, thus creating more capital than in traditional forms of manufacturing. Under the factory system, unskilled workers toiled long hours for little pay. The money factory owners saved could be reinvested into manufacturing or invested into new activities in mechanized forms of farming or in financial investments. With industrialization, Western elites, whether owners of factories or large industrialized farms, became more interested in accumulating capital, rather than acquiring landed estates and noble titles, which had been important status symbols in European society for over 1,000 years. The mechanization of agriculture and the creation of the factory system created Western society. As elites began to mechanize agriculture, they forced rural populations off their land. Unemployed and homeless farmhands migrated to cities in search of employment and a place to live. There they found low-paying jobs as unskilled factory laborers in growing manufacturing centers throughout Western Europe. These developments transformed society in Western Europe from a mostly rural society into an urban society based on capitalism. If rural areas in Western Europe had become depopulated, urban centers became overpopulated, crowded and unhealthy areas where capitalism thrived for the new social classes. This process is called the Industrial Revolution, which, in reality, is a series of revolutions, each driven by a different technology. The first Industrial Revolution began in 17th century Great Britain. It was driven by water and steam engines, powered first by quick-flowing rivers and, increasingly, by coal. The first Industrial Revolution continued into the 18th century, as entrepreneurs in the Netherlands and France learned how to harness the power of steam, partially through espionage and partially through their own discoveries in the applied sciences. Coal now became essential for industrialization. Without coal, emerging industrial countries could not power factories to compete with the ones in Britain, France, and the Netherlands. The use of coal led to new forms of locomotion, the railroads and steamships, which led in turn to a growing demand for iron and steel. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had spread to other countries in Europe: Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal, and the Americas, primarily the United States. Later on, industrialization spread to Japan and made inroads in Russia. And yet, Britain remained in the lead economically as the most industrialized and thus the most powerful country in the world. But Germany and France were quickly catching up, and the United States was not far behind. In the second half of the 19th century, already a second industrial revolution was beginning, driven by the discovery of petroleum. Although coal remained important throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and still does today, petroleum increasingly became a key to economic success in the West. The West's lead in the race to further modernization ensured that industrialization remained identified with the West, despite inroads elsewhere in the world. Western civilization and the industrialized world remain synonymous. We will stop here with our discussion of industrialization to turn instead to an important accident of history. This process of industrialization that was changing humanity occurred in European and American countries where Christianity had taken root centuries before. Given the historical overlap of industrialization and Christianity in Europe and America, many people inside and outside the industrialized world erroneously assumed that a causative relationship existed between capitalism and Christianity. This erroneous idea was based on the fallacy that historical coincidence is proof of causation. In order to understand the connection between anti-Semitism in the West, we need to return to our discussion of how industrialization changed society and culture. Prior to industrialization, and for over 1,000 years, European societies had been divided into 3 orders or estates. An order or estate is a social group that is defined by its function in society. You are normally born into an order or estate and remain in the same order or estate for life. In pre-industrialized society, the first order was constituted by the clergy. Its function was to provide a link between the Christian God and the members of society. The second order was larger than the first and was constituted by the nobility. Their role was to protect society by fighting. By far the largest order was the third estate, or the commons. It was made up of everyone who did not belong to the first 2 orders. It varied widely in terms of wealth. The role of the commons was to work and create wealth that supported the clergy for providing them with a connection to their God, and that supported the nobility who protected them. Most were impoverished and had little to no property, but a small group at the top of the third estate were increasingly wealthy, and over time accumulated more and more wealth. It is also helpful to think of society in another way that describes how power and wealth was shared. Viewed from this perspective, European society was divided into two groups, the elite and subordinate classes. The elites constituted a very small portion of society, between 3 and 8% of the population, and controlled most of the power and wealth in society. The subordinate classes constituted between 92 and 97% of the population and had little to no control over power and wealth. The elites were divided into two overlapping groups, a monarchy and a nobility on the one hand, and local church leaders on the other. The subordinate classes consisted primarily of peasants, that is, farm laborers of varying wealth, poor clerics, merchants, poor city dwellers, and the homeless. Beginning in the 14th century, a new social group began to emerge in Europe among the subordinate classes. It was tied to commercial activities in the cities, where the subordinate classes were more likely to be ignored by an elite who preferred to live in the countryside. This emergent group became known as the middle class because it was less powerful than the elites, but much more powerful than poorer members of the subordinate classes. This middle class was in reality a complex social group consisting of many professions, such as doctors, lawyers, bureaucrats or state employees, merchants, and small landowners. It was this middle class that provided the leadership for the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, they had grown so powerful that they challenged the traditional elites among the nobility and clergy. New elite and subordinate classes emerged in a new industrial society everywhere in the West. The new elite classes consisted of the upper classes and the much larger middle classes. The upper classes were the smaller of the two elite social groups and consisted of very wealthy industrialists and capitalists, as well as hangers-on from the old way of running things. The middle classes were the larger of the two elite social groups and consisted of small investors, professionals, and members of a new managerial class that ran industry for the industrialists and capitalists. The social boundaries between the new elites were porous, meaning that social mobility occurred within the elite. Members of the middle classes might strike it rich and join the upper classes, and wealthy industrialists and capitalists might lose wealth and fall back into the middle classes. The new subordinate classes in industrial society were different from their counterparts in pre-industrial society. They could be broken down into two subgroups, the working classes and the indigent poor, a subgroup that was always on the verge of starvation. The working classes, that is, people who live by manual labor, could be broken down further into industrial and agricultural workers. Factory workers were the larger of the two subgroups, and their numbers steadily increased over time. Agricultural workers, by contrast, were fewer in number and declined over time, owing to the investment of technology and capital in the agricultural world. The elites and the middle classes in particular constituted the group most responsible for the creation of Western civilization. Industrial leaders mainly came from pre-industrial social groups that had worked for a living in the Third Estate. Work was an activity that the nobility and clergy had disdained and had refused to engage in, because being noble was associated with not getting one's hands dirty by working. In the industrial world, the middle classes used the fact that power was measured by the amount of capital one had to overtake the power of monarchs, the nobility, and the church. The old elite classes either reinvented themselves as members of the new elite or fought a losing battle against the new elites. The new industrial elite defined taste in the industrial age and created what was called by contemporaries modern culture. Middle-class taste dominated industrial society and replaced traditional culture, by which contemporaries meant first pre-industrial culture, and as time passed, culture belonging to previous generations, because the middle classes assumed that progress dictated the constant renewal of taste. One of the cornerstones of middle-class taste was consumerism, a preoccupation with purchasing consumer goods and services for the sake of projecting an image, of keeping up with modernity, and outdoing others in society in the process. The middle classes viewed the world in terms of competition. Business experiences and discoveries in the natural and social sciences validated the view that natural and social organisms were locked in a struggle for survival, in which only the fittest survived. An inability to adapt resulted in extinction, whether one was talking about the dinosaurs or humans. The middle classes increasingly shifted educational value away from mastering disciplines like history, philosophy, and the arts to different disciplines that the middle classes justified as being practical, meaning that the knowledge was indispensable for making money in the new economy. New topics that had never been studied before in higher education, like accounting, management, marketing, finance, computing, communication, and the like, were quickly added to the curriculum of Western colleges and universities. New emphases were placed on the natural sciences and how they could be applied to making money in the new economy. The social sciences, another area of knowledge that was invented by the middle classes during the Industrial Revolution, was added to the curriculum of Western colleges and universities and justified because they could be used by graduates to make money in an industrialized world. And let us not forget greed. Yes, greed, another middle-class value that became a driving force, even if some members of the middle classes attempted to temper it with religion and morality. In short, the new middle classes identified their values as those of industrial society and equated their views with modernity and the West. Those who identified with traditional values, and even non-Westerners, identified the European and American middle classes with the New World Order. Now, you may be wondering at this point what the emergence of industrial society and middle-class culture has to do with anti-Semitism. In a few weeks, we will examine the impact of the ancient Roman Empire's destruction of the Jewish temple in the 1st century CE. Without their temple, Jews were unable to carry out animal sacrifices as their God commanded, because their God also prohibited them from sacrificing animals anywhere else. So, Jewish religious practices shifted solely to reading, writing, and seeking deeper meaning in religious texts. This change in Jewish practices meant that for the next 2,000 years, most Jews were the few people in the world who were literate and trained in critical thinking. In the rest of Europe, most Christians, even the elite, were illiterate and did not value critical thinking. Indeed, European Christian communities did not attain similar rates of literacy as Jewish communities until the middle of the 20th century. As Europe began to industrialize in the 17th century, the new economy required literate people who could think critically so that they could become leaders in business and finance, the same type of skills that Jews had mastered for religious purposes so long ago. Thus, as the Industrial Revolution began, most Jews had the skills required for success among the new middle classes. Many Jews were now willing to leave rural and traditional Jewish communities and to live alongside Christians in urban centers so that they could prosper in the new economy and fill the ranks of the new professional classes. Elites who did not accept modern society and the growing impoverished working classes grew antagonistic toward the middle classes, including toward middle-class Jews. Some were envious of their success in the new economy and, as we shall see, often took out their anger against all Jews because the opponents of industrialization had never accepted Jews as part of European society. The industrialized world was precarious. Although modern life was not necessarily more difficult, more precarious, or more unpredictable than pre-modern life, many contemporaries drew those conclusions. During the 19th century, economic depression occurred about every 10 years, and they seemed to be increasingly more extreme. A growing number of people began to think that modern life was not sustainable in the long run. The extraordinary ferocity of the First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, seemed to bear out the most dire predictions. It was the first industrial war, and it resulted in approximately 37 million casualties, including 10 million civilians. Were Homo sapiens doomed to go the way of the dinosaurs because of industrialization? As we shall see, many people who worried about the fate of the modern world made the Jews the scapegoats, because many Jews had been seen as profiting disproportionately from capitalism. So the losers in capitalist society in the West blamed the Jews for the evils of industrialization. Our discussion thus leads us to form two theories that we will test in this course. First, a potential for anti-Semitism is ever present in the West because Western societies identified themselves as the chosen people of the God of Abraham. For these societies, the persistence of the Jews constituted a permanent challenge to their identity. Second, a potential also exists in capitalist societies for anti-Semitism owing to the history of the Industrial Revolution. Modern industrial societies gave Jews an opportunity for socioeconomic advancement in industrializing societies because of the emphasis the Jews had placed in their religious practices on literacy and critical thinking for about 2,000 years. The success of a few wealthy and middle-class Jews in the modern industrial world was such a new and extraordinary phenomenon that it made many non-Jewish members of the elite and members of the subordinate classes uncomfortable. The world that the Industrial Revolution created challenged their anti-Semitic worldview. In the first podcast, I talked about how socioeconomic and cultural groups practiced othering to exclude categories of people who were not supposed to win in society. Jews were not supposed to become members of society, let alone members of the new middle classes, and, in a few rare circumstances, members of the upper classes. Non-Jews who felt left behind by the industrial transformation of society, and those who faced financial ruin by the ups and downs of capitalism, could not accept the new capitalist world order. Even many who found success under capitalism did not want to have to compete with Jews. In the dog-eat-dog world of capitalism, new competitors, whether they were Jews, people thought of as colored, women, bisexuals, gay or lesbians, the disabled, members of the working classes, transsexuals, blacks, Africans or Asians, indigenous people, or simply people born into the subordinate classes. These others were not supposed to be competitors in the struggle for existence among the middle classes. Their equal opportunity made failure for those who had drawn comfort from the way things used to be much more likely. The endemic boom-to-bust cycles in industrial society led people to seek causes for the precariousness of life and the constant threat of economic ruin. Enemies of industrialization on the one hand, and people who either lost out in economic downturns or believed that modern life had dealt them an unfair hand on the other, looked for the culprits of their misfortune. The Jews became scapegoats, and anti-Semitism a convenient hatred.